Detoxification and drainage for me, they really are the most important aspects of recovery. We look at the soup of environmental toxicants that we're surrounded by every day, and I don't think that it's probably ever been more significant than it is now. The number of things, the chemicals, the pesticides, all of these things, just amazing.
Let's ditch the quick fix and dive into today's conversation. All right, welcome everybody. My guest today is Scott Forsgren. Scott is a health coach, blogger, podcaster, health writer, and advocate. He is the editor and founder of BetterHealthGuide.com, where he shares his 25-year journey through the world of Lyme disease, mold illness, and the myriad of factors that chronic illness often entails. Scott has been interviewed on numerous podcasts and has lectured on his recovery from chronic illness at conferences and on several online summits. He has written for the Townsend Letter and other publications. Scott is the co-founder of the Forum for Integrative Medicine, which hosts an annual conference bringing together some of the top integrative practitioners to share practical tools for treating complex and chronic illness. Scott is very grateful for his current state of health and all that he has learned on his life-changing journey. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
Hey, it's an honor to have you, and I know our listeners will be blessed by all that you have to share. And we'd love to start out with you just kind of sharing your model that you've used historically and that you're using today. Give us a little bit more on your journey to where you're at today.
Yeah, so my journey was living in Northern California, having a tick bite in 1996. I mean, this has been a long, long process. I didn't immediately become ill, but in April of 97, so we're literally just coming up on 25 years, my health just fell apart over the course of a weekend. It felt like a flu times 100, had never experienced anything like it. Honestly, at times wasn't sure that I would even survive it, and came to the point that would have actually been okay. So it was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. One of the worst symptoms was head to toe burning sensations that really felt like I had been out at the beach all day long and had this terrible sunburn. I couldn't sit up straight in a chair. I had to put pillows down the side of the bed so that I could keep myself from feeling like I was going to roll onto the floor. I had a lot of gut issues, muscle and joint pain, fasciculations or twitching, crawling sensations, lots of neurological things, light sensitivity, sound sensitivity, heart palpitations. I mean, the list of things, it was just insane. I mean, the number of symptoms that I was experiencing. And so I went to 45 different doctors, neurologists, infectious disease, I mean, everyone you could think of. And in 8 years and having seen 45 different doctors, the most consistent recommendation was to see a psychiatrist. And so that wasn't tremendously helpful. I knew that it wasn't a psychological condition at the time. So from 1997 to 2005, 45 doctors. I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia. Another practitioner suggested we explore MS, which fortunately that did not seem to be a diagnosis that I actually had. But there's so much overlap in these conditions. And so finally in 2005, I started over with a new medical doctor, and he referred me to an acupuncturist that was doing EAV, or electroacupuncture according to Vol. Electrodermal screening is another term for that. And he said, ask her what foods you need to avoid. And that's probably the only thing that could possibly be wrong with you. There's nothing else that could explain this. And so I did, and sat with this lady for a couple of hours. She worked at an outlet mall next to a coffee shop, and it was kind of a strange experience. And she said, I would have your doctor test you for Borrelia, Bartonella, Babesia, and Ehrlichia. And my suspicion is that you have something in the realm of Lyme disease. First time I had really heard of it. I mean, maybe I'd heard of it, but I didn't really even know what it was. And so ultimately, we were able to confirm all of those microbial issues that she mentioned through her system of energetic testing. So that led me down a path of really having piqued my curiosity in energy medicine, energetic testing, starting to mentor with Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt and his way of approaching getting information from the body. And so it was a long journey, lots of practitioners after that time. So the Lyme diagnosis was in 2005, lots of work. We're going to talk about a lot of those things today, but I am so incredibly blessed from having probably spent on average 16 hours a day in bed at that point. I mean, when I would drag myself into an office, I couldn't even wear shoes because the pain in my feet was so bad. I mean, it was just a crazy time, to now working more than full time, going to the gym every morning. I mean, there's nothing that physically limits me in terms of just really feeling incredibly blessed and having a very active life. And I will say that I still do take very good care of myself. I still focus on optimizing my health. I don't think you go through something like this and come out of it living the way you lived before. I mean, I think in some ways that's part of the message of these types of conditions. And so prioritizing myself became one of the gifts of this whole journey. And out of this process, kind of emerged in my mind from the universe connecting me to some amazing people like Dietrich Klinghardt and Dr. Neil Nathan and Simon Yu and Raj Patel, all incredible doctors that have been guides for me for many years. I think all of them I've known for at least a decade now. And so the model that's kind of emerged in my mind is a way to look at healing from these complex chronic conditions. Maybe it's Lyme, maybe it's mold, maybe it's some other neurological or complex chronic condition. It doesn't mean that the order is going to be exactly the same for each person. There is some flexibility here. So it's not a protocol, but it's just kind of the way I think about these things. And so at this point, this is kind of an 11-step model. The first step, and it is the one that I think is the most important foundationally, is really supporting detoxification and drainage, working with the terrain, improving the terrain. What was it about the terrain that led to these conditions in the first place? Step 2 is looking at the external environment. What about the external environment is stressing our body, stressing us as an organism? Is it that we're living in a water damaged building with mold exposure, which is super common? Is it that we have high levels of electromagnetic fields that we need to reduce? So that's step 2. Step 3 is optimizing sleep. Step 4 is looking at the mental, emotional health contributors, past traumas and conflicts. Those very commonly either set the stage or are something that result from the invalidation of the conventional medicine going through this process. Step 5 is working with the limbic system, working with the parasympathetic nervous system to support healing. Step 6 is what can we do to modulate inflammation and also the immune system? Looking at mast cell activation, for example, is one of those contributors. Step 7 is optimizing our hydration, our nutrition, our microbiome, the gut health, all of those pieces. And then step 8 is a group of supportive things or interventions that I think are commonly overlooked that we should give some thought to. Things like coagulation or hypercoagulation, very common. In fact, I would say that's probably one of the number one most overlooked things that I see in this population of people, myself included, very significant. Cryptopyruria is another one that Dr. Klinghardt talks about, making sure the mitochondria, the adrenals are supported. Step 9, which people think about as much earlier most of the time, as did I, is finally getting into some of these microbial overgrowths. What about the viruses, the retroviruses, the parasites, the dysbiosis, the SIBO, the fungus, the Lyme, the co-infections, the biofilms, all of those pieces. And then step 10 is, are there some dental contributors? Now, this is one that could move earlier, but I think a lot of times you want to get the foundation in place, even if there are some dental issues, to facilitate fewer complications, better healing, better outcome. And then step 11 ultimately is regeneration and restoration. What do we need to do after we've been through this whole process to try to regenerate and restore the body as much as possible?
That's awesome. I think, as I prepared for this interview, I have just been amazed at your intellect and your ability to process all this very technical and complicated information, because the human body is an amazingly well-designed body, and it is very, very complicated. So then you couple that with your own personal journey, and you've really kind of laid it out there. It's like, hey, this is not a quick journey. It's been a lifelong journey, and that's part of the whole idea, is to help people kind of switch gears a little bit, to know that you might go down a really good road that some doctor gives you, and it might give you some help, but it's not the whole picture. And so you kept on going down the roads, and then here you are in that mall, and you get kind of introduced to a whole different game, and you go, hey, well, I'm going to listen to this, and I'm going to give it a try. I went through some Vega testing in one of my own autoimmune things that went kind of sideways for me when I was about 50 years old. I'm 62 now. So, and I've been on my own personal health journey for various reasons as well. And I think that's kind of a big part of this. So what you're touching on here in your model is what you've come with life experience that is just amazing. So let's come back to the start of this and hit on that detox. And what we're really going to talk about here is the difference between the terrain approach to health and the germ approach to health. And that's why you've got the microbial step down there a little bit of ways. It's still important, but it maybe isn't the first thing, like you said, from all your experience. So let's start with that detox and drainage kind of conversation, and we'll go down the list.
Yeah, and I will say, I mean, it sounds at this point, hopefully, like I've put a lot of this together. When that lady at the mall first gave me those recommendations, I will admit it took some nudging on her part to get me to really pursue it. It took some time for my mind to expand. I was a software development person working here in Silicon Valley, and it just didn't make a lot of sense to me at that point. So as much as I now think that really was a turning point, it took some time for my mind to expand. And I think that's some of the process that we go through with these conditions as well. So detoxification and drainage, for me, they really are the most important aspects of recovery. We look at the soup of environmental toxicants that we're surrounded by every day, and I don't think that it's probably ever been more significant than it is now. The number of things, the chemicals, the pesticides, all of these things, just amazing. And so I don't think that most people would be impacted by Lyme and co-infections and all of these things if we didn't have such a toxic environment, a toxic body burden, the terrain. And so I do think, building on your comments, I do think that improving the terrain is the road back. And that doesn't mean it's the only thing we do, but it does mean that foundationally, if you want to sustain improvement, you really have to work on the terrain. And so when we also think about some of the microorganisms like Candida, for example, or parasites, they may actually be in the body or allowed in the body to protect us from some of these environmental toxicants, from heavy metals, for example. So I also think of detoxification as having some indirect antimicrobial properties as well. Again, what can we do to minimize the need for some of these organisms that we think of as bad, but they may actually be serving a protective purpose or role in the body at a particular time. So the first step in detoxification is always going to be looking at what can we do to reduce or minimize the incoming toxicants. Personal care products, scented products, laundry products, making sure that our air, our food, our water are as pure as possible. Thinking about toxins that maybe are introduced into the body as well from things like breast implants is a common contributor that people see that can be another burden on their health. Sometimes metal implants in the body can trigger some immune dysregulation, some inflammation as well. So the concept of detoxification for me is primarily about binders. Once we get toxins from the liver into the bile, the gallbladder, the small intestine, what can we do to grab onto them to minimize enterohepatic recirculation of bile and toxins back into the system? So the goal is, once they're in the small intestine, to bind with them. It's not always a strong bond. It can actually end up getting released. But the idea is to, as much as possible, bind to these toxicants and move them out through the stool. Drainage, on the other hand, is more about supporting the body's innate ability to process and excrete toxins. So what can we do to support the liver, the gallbladder, the kidneys, the lymphatics, the extracellular matrix, the colon, the skin, the lungs? We need to optimize all of those as much as possible. Very early in this whole process is addressing constipation. If people aren't pooping, that's not going to go with the idea of detoxification and drainage, and it's not going to go with the idea of healing. So we need to work on those things. The gallbladder plays a fairly large role in this realm. We're talking about bile as the way that toxins are hopefully going to get to these binders that we're using. If we're not supporting that production of bile and flow of bile, then chances are we're not really going to get as much effect from the binders that we're taking. And there's also the possibility, this is based on Chris Shade's work, Kelly Halderman, both amazing doctors. Dr. Kelly Halderman calls this phase 2.5. If you're not optimizing that pathway that we just talked about, oftentimes these toxins will get dumped back into the bloodstream and create a detox reaction or Herxheimer reaction. So we want to think about supporting the bile and making sure that we're getting the most efficient effect from those binders. And there's lots of different tools. There isn't one binder. I actually personally feel like a rotation of binders over time is a smart strategy. You don't want the same thing all the time. Takasumi Supreme is one that I've worked with for many years, and there's a number of great binders from Cellcore Biosciences or Microbe Formulas, same company. One is the practitioner line, one is a retail line. Other tools like chlorella, bentonite clay, zeolite, lots of tools in that realm that can be great. And then drainage, lots of different tools. I personally am most drawn to homeopathic drainage remedies for liver, kidneys, lymphatics, the extracellular matrix. Great companies like Energetics, Pacana, Desbio. Herbs can play a role here as well. So if we're looking at things like milk thistle or dandelion for the liver, for the gallbladder, solidago for the kidneys, red root for the lymphatic system. So you can use herbs and homeopathy. But I do think that a lot of times this concept of drainage is missing from people's approach to recovery. And I do think that it's very important. And then continuing on thinking about trace minerals, a lot of times the reason we have more heavy metal burden in the body, that we're holding on to some of these environmental toxicants, is because we're trace mineral deficient. Silica, for example, can be fantastic for helping to deal with aluminum. So looking at what we might need to do from a mineral perspective to also set the foundation for detoxification. And then making sure that we're moving. Even if all you can do is walking, that is tremendously helpful for keeping the lymphatic system moving. And if you have a stagnation of fluids in the body, it's going to be really difficult, even if you're doing a lot of these other things that you're taking. So at least walking. And then things like coffee enemas, personally, life-saving. I mean, they were tremendous. Colon hydrotherapy, ionic foot baths, castor oil packs, oil pulling is another strategy. Liver gallbladder flushes, with the caveat that I don't think people should try doing liver gallbladder flushes without some guidance of a healthcare practitioner, because I think there is some potential for getting yourself into some trouble with those. They can be a little too aggressive for some people. And then sauna is another strategy that can be great also. I don't think it's always the place to start, because I think we think of sweating things out of the body. But I also think that sauna, particularly far infrared, can mobilize some toxins within the body. And if you haven't done the detox, the drainage, opened the emunctories, the channels of elimination, you have this possibility of redistribution of some toxins. So it's kind of with sauna, I think it's a right place, right time, right person scenario where it can be amazing. But if anything in this process is making you feel significantly worse for a reasonably long period of time, I think you should step back and question it. Is it too aggressive? Is there something else you're missing? I don't think healing has to be a battle or an uncomfortable process. So that's kind of my thoughts on detoxification and drainage at a high level.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And you kind of touch on something that, I've utilized in my nutritional approach. It's kind of that cycling mentality. It's kind of like you eat fresh berries in the Northwest in the spring. You don't get fresh berries in the Northwest in the fall or the winter. And it's kind of like what you're saying with your detox approach is that, one detox method is going to pick up a certain amount in your body and another. And it's kind of interesting. I don't know if you've really found combinations, not to stay on this particular topic too long, but have you found different combinations work well together, the different types of detox, whether it's a supplement along with a sauna or, coffee enema along with another type of detox strategy, or is it, not necessarily synergistic that way?
I think it is synergistic. I can't say that it's specific combinations that stand out, but it is implementing multiple tools, doing something for binding, doing some homeopathic drainage, doing some herbal drainage, incorporating coffee enemas or other strategies, ionic foot baths, things like that. So I think we want to incorporate, as Dr. Klinghardt would say, you want some biochemical interventions, you want some physics-based interventions. So that's when we're getting into foot baths and things of that nature. But layering in these tools in a way that's comfortable and supportive of that detoxification process.
Yeah. And as we jump into, just before we jump into the step 2 there, the environmental factors, in the last couple of years specifically, there's been other things that are causing some toxicity. Have you noticed benefits or towards trying to help people post illness and or post treatment they may have taken for an illness, whether it be an injection or whatever it may be? A specific detox approach for those kinds of things?
What I've noticed in the last couple of years is a lot of the things people are experiencing post-viral situation are the presentations seem to overlap a lot with the things that people have experienced in the chronic Lyme arena. And so I certainly know many practitioners have learned from some great people that have observed that after dealing with that viral situation, that there can be activation of things like Epstein-Barr virus, like mycoplasmas, like Bartonellas, that then can create this long haul or longer type presentation. I also think that there's a lot of immune dysregulation that's happening, and we're going to talk more about immune dysregulation and immune modulation. But it's been very interesting to me to see how much overlap there is. And in some ways, as bad as the last couple of years have been, and certainly have been significant stressors for most of society, I think the one potential good thing is it's bringing more awareness to these chronic conditions where people with chronic Lyme disease, haven't always felt supported. I mean, we, for the most part, when we're dealing with this condition, are already living in an isolated lockdown type manner without a lot of interactions with the world and things of that nature. So I do hope that this leads us to better understanding of these chronic conditions overall, because I think there is a lot of overlap between what we're talking about and what people are now starting to experience, unfortunately.
Yeah, and then it's always, I think the best thing to do is put how do we make this a glass of lemonade, and that's what you're doing. You're sharing the ways to make it a positive, and that's really exciting. So we're talking a little bit about that detox inside the body. We've got a whole lot of exposures on the outside of the body. So why don't we jump into step 2 and talk about the environment and how that impacts us?
Yeah, so I think our internal environment will only ever be as healthy or as good as our external environment. And again, that's why so many of us today are sick. The external environment has become so incredibly toxic in so many ways. And so we can take supplements all day long, but if the external environment in our home, our school, our workplace, even our car, if those are our kryptonite, it's going to be really difficult to regain our superhero status. So we really need to look at those things. I would say that first and foremost is mold, or really we say mold, but it's really this soup of toxicants that we find in water damaged buildings. So there is mold, there are mycotoxins, but there's also bacteria, there's endotoxins, there's all kinds of things. So we kind of generalize it to say mold, but what we're really talking about is that soup of things from water damaged buildings. And I would say most people with chronic Lyme disease that have any long-term condition, long-term illness that are not recovering with what they're attempting to do, one of the most common reasons is ongoing exposure to water damaged buildings. And if you look for it, you can usually find it. There's unfortunately not a perfect way to test for or explore this. I would say for testing the external environment, the ERMI, or Environmental Relative Moldiness Index from Mycometrics or Envirobiomics, can be helpful. Again, it's not perfect. Sometimes you have to have someone help you interpret it because the score itself is not often a perfect representation of the reality. There's also, Dr. Neil Nathan likes to do some immunolytics plates in addition to things like the ERMI, where you're putting out some plates, you set them out for an hour or two, put the lid on, you watch to see what grows, and then you can mail them back and have the lab actually tell you what's growing on them. I wouldn't do that as the only strategy for exploring the environment, but it's one more piece of information. And then if the finances are not a concern and you really just want to optimize your health, and getting an indoor environmental professional to come and actually do professional testing, I think is a fantastic strategy. Sometimes it is cost prohibitive, but that really is the gold standard for looking at maybe things inside the body that could also be clues that this is a potential factor. There are urine mycotoxin tests.
Right.
They're highly debated. Some people think they're absolutely erroneous, sending us down a wrong path. I have, in this realm, primarily mentored with Dr. Neil Nathan. Real-time labs, for example, I think can be very, very helpful. Great Plains, Vibrant, there's a few others in this realm. And so again, it's one piece of information. It's not the thing that you entirely hang your hat on, but it can be helpful over time to see, are you supporting detoxification now and seeing higher levels, which could actually be a good thing. At some point, you should see that those become negative, or there's potentially still an ongoing environmental exposure to them, or there could be some colonization where you now have colonized in the sinuses or the gut potentially.
Right.
So once we identify that there is a potential issue, then we either need to remediate it or move to a new environment. Sometimes that moving process can just be, jumping from the frying pan to the fire and moving through, one moldy environment after another. So oftentimes my observation has been that if it's not a super significant issue, sometimes working with a known issue and doing remediation can be helpful. There will be some people that cannot heal in the same environment that made them sick, and they need to figure out a way to, change that environment. But I would say if someone's dealing with chronic Lyme disease or a chronic health challenge, neurological type conditions, those types of things, not exploring this really is doing a significant disservice. If I had known about this earlier, I probably could have saved a lot of money and a lot of years. So I really do urge people to explore their environment. Air filters can be helpful. They're not going to be the solution. I think of them a lot like there's a hole in the bottom of the boat, and fixing the mold issue, the water damaged issue is plugging the hole. Using an air filter is bailing out the boat with paper towels. It's going to help, but it's not going to be the complete solution. If you have a tumor, you really need to remove that tumor before you start the chemotherapy, just as an example. So
Sure.
Eliminating the exposure, incorporating the binders that we talked about in step one. There are some things in the mold and mycotoxin realm that can be a little more specific. For example, Cellcore's biotoxin binder can be very helpful. Beyond Balance has a Toxys bind and a Pro Myco product that's nice. Takasumi Supreme that we talked about earlier can be great. And then some people will benefit from things like cholestyramine or Welchol, which are pharmaceutical interventions. For the most part, cholestyramine seems to be rather difficult for people to tolerate. Lots of constipation, GI issues, heartburn, those types of things. Welchol is not as effective as cholestyramine, but can be much better tolerated. So, looking at these types of tools, what can we do to start to then unburden the mycotoxin burden in the body itself? And then we'll talk later about some of the microbial pieces, but you may need to think about, are you now colonized with Aspergillus in the sinuses, for example? And what do we need to do? We can change our external environment, but what if now you have a mycotoxin producing factory inside the body? It doesn't then matter how clean the external environment is. It's still going to be better, but you're not going to completely solve the problem. And so this is an area that Neil Nathan has done fantastically and articulated in his book, Toxic, that I highly recommend people take a look at. And so once we remove this roadblock to our recovery, I think, really then things can oftentimes start moving forward. Now, in the EMF realm, I think that's another very significant thing for us to consider. And it's interesting that, the EMF exposure in the environment has really exponentially been increasing over the past many years. Chronic illness is also increasing. Is it the only factor? Certainly not. But when we think about EMFs, there are thoughts that really impacts our detoxification. That if we're in this constant cellular sympathetic dominance from this external threat, that we're not then going to be able to detoxify. It's actually interesting to see when people put sleep canopies in place to reduce their EMF exposure. Sometimes they have an incredible, detoxification reactions just from taking away that EMF. That has to be done in a very methodical way oftentimes. But things like turning off your Wi-Fi, tossing out your cordless phone, sleeping in a Faraday cage, which I've done since 2006 at the urging of Dr. Klinghardt, thinking about the electric fields that come out from the walls, the dirty electricity, those types of things. I think reducing those exposures is also another piece of setting the foundation for healing. Grounding, getting out in nature, that can also help to kind of discharge some of this man-made electrical and electromagnetic exposure that we constantly are dealing with. But really important to either get a meter, do some testing, or get a building biologist to come out and evaluate. Sometimes the sources are surprising. And it's also interesting that part of why the EMF piece also comes after the detoxification piece is people that are more electromagnetically hypersensitive, or what they call EHS. They're oftentimes dealing with higher levels of heavy metals, which kind of make us more of an antenna. And so that detoxification piece that we talked about earlier is also over time going to help to minimize the effects of some of the EMFs that we cannot mitigate. At the same time, we cannot, if you're already dealing with the chronic illness, you can't expect to get better if you don't do something to reduce or mitigate these exposures. It's just another environmental toxicant that we need to do what we can to address.
Yeah, and again, such good information. And the building biologist, there's different people that do check for mold. All those are options, and we're dealing with invisible things, and it's always kind of hard to be afraid of invisible things. It's like they're there, but we don't recognize it. But good tips. So that kind of leads right into how it impacts our rest. We're talking about things, that are impacting our terrain, that has an impact on how we rest. And you've kind of started to touch on that. And that would be our next step in this 11-step process, number 3.
Yeah. So one of the primary contributors to insomnia is going to be electromagnetic field exposure. This coming from Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt's work. So that's why, again, we're trying to address that in step 2 before we really focus on sleep, because that can oftentimes be one of the primary contributors. Sleep for me was never an issue. Thank goodness. My sleep was amazing. Even when I was at my worst, it was my only time I could escape at that time, the hell of what my life had become. Yeah. And so my sleep was always good until a few years ago. I started having some sleep issues. And so it has been an area where I've tried lots of things. Fortunately, now my sleep is quite good. But, common supplements, melatonin for many people is a game changer. I joke that it's my drug of choice. GABA, 5-HTP. But I oftentimes think that we're maybe missing some things like, would it be helpful to put a continuous glucose monitor in place and see if the blood sugar is going so low in the middle of the night that the body then is producing cortisol to balance the blood sugar? But by the time we have cortisol, we're not going to sleep. And so looking at the blood sugar, looking at oxygen saturation, is there some sleep apnea, even if it's mild, that's maybe contributing to poor sleep? Some people do well with weighted blankets. I use them. I have them. I don't know that it was a huge thing, but it's another tool. Inclined bed therapy is another tool that actually can be quite helpful for sleep, but also for the lymphatic drainage. Tools like Brain Tap, which is a headset that has light frequency sound that can really get you into a more parasympathetic state. Or there's a wearable band called the Apollo that also has some vibrational programs in it that can kind of help with sleep. So lots of different tools. I am a fan of using an Aura Ring to track sleep and observe patterns. And yes, you can put the Aura Ring in airplane mode so that you're not getting more exposures to EMFs from the use of the ring itself. histamine that we're going to talk about later in this mast cell realm. Histamine can be a reason people aren't sleeping. So sometimes incorporating mast cell stabilizers and natural antihistamines can really help with sleep as well. But this is so early, step 3, this is early in this process, because the more we can optimize our sleep, the more we're going to exponentially increase our overall healing potential and really potentize or synergize a lot of the other things that we're doing to recover our health.
That we're doing. Those are all good. Curious, just recently, they've been using melatonin for some of the viral issues. And I was seeing some pretty high doses. And what do you typically see for dosing for just general sleep? And with those higher doses, like 36 milligrams, or I think I saw 72 milligrams, somebody was recommending, and we're basically typically my knowledge, which is limited on this, but was 3 to 7 milligrams, and for children 1 to 2 milligrams. So what is your current take on melatonin dosage?
Yeah. So for people that really want to dive into this, I did a podcast recently with Dr. John Lawrence, who has a book that he's written about melatonin, every aspect of health and from a lens of melatonin. And it's really very interesting. I think for many people, the 3 to 5 milligram realm is probably going to work well for sleep. I personally take 20 milligrams a night. I have seen some people recommending 200 milligrams. I mean, I think when you get into that realm, you need to be working with a practitioner. There can be some detoxification reactions. There can be some viral activation. There can be some other things that might need to be supported. But there are, in fact, I think it's Dr. Russell Reiter in Texas that Dr. Klinghardt and Dr. Lawrence both talk about, where they share that he personally, as a researcher of melatonin, uses somewhere in the 100 to 200 milligrams a night. So I think, when you're doing that, it's not just for purposes of sleep. And a lot of times people actually, if they're using it for cancers or other things, they may actually be using it throughout the day. And when you're using it throughout the day, for most people, it does not cause sleep. If you're using melatonin in light, it's not going to have the same effect as melatonin and darkness. So when you're getting into those realms, you're probably not doing it for sleep. You're probably doing it for other purposes. But I do think melatonin is great if people are really interested in this realm. Doris Lowe, LOH, is another researcher that's done a lot of work in the melatonin arena. That is a fantastic resource.
Awesome. I appreciate you expanding on that just a little bit. So why don't we go into step 4? We're kind of leading into one of a huge part of health. Your mind is a powerful tool, both good and bad. And so part of this step 4 is emotional history and emotional trauma, how you react to the stressors and things of that nature. So take us through emotional well-being. That'd be great.
When I started my journey learning with Dr. Klinghardt, so diagnosed with Lyme July 2005, at Dr. Klinghardt's conference January 2006, in the front row, annoying him with lots of questions. My perspective was kill the bugs, then maybe we do some detoxification, and the mental emotional piece must not be that significant. Now my perspective years later is completely the opposite, that the mental emotional piece probably is the most important, that the detoxification piece is next from a physical body perspective, and then killing the bugs. Really, yes, we may need to do some work there, but if we do the other things right, that doesn't have to be quite as big of a hammer, that we can be a little less aggressive. And so I think there are traumas and conflicts that set the stage for illness. Many people in this chronic illness population that have had adverse childhood experiences or ACEs. But I also think there's people that maybe didn't have emotional contributors to the illness. But as I mentioned earlier, the process of feeling so isolated, feeling so invalidated by the medical community when they don't have any solutions for these complex chronic conditions, that in and of itself creates an emotional trauma that we still need to explore. So I think reality is most everyone dealing with a complex chronic condition has some emotional work that needs to be explored and that can really optimize their healing. And again, accepting that doesn't mean that the illness is all in your head, but our mental, emotional health do play a role in the development of physical conditions, as you mentioned. My observation in the Lyme arena is that a fairly common pattern is type A, overachiever, perfectionist, oftentimes not feeling that we deserve to be well, that we have to do to prove our worth and value. And this is all my personal experience as well. I'm proud to say I'm now a type A minus personality. Probably will always be type A, but making progress. So cultivating healthy relationships, eliminating toxic people, experiencing joy, not identifying with illness. I think when we label ourselves as, oh, I'm a limey or I'm, this or that, I think that really does us a disservice, that the illness is a part of us, but it's not us. It's not who we have become. And when we look at Dr. Dietrich Klinghart's 5 levels of healing, work on this level is really the 3rd level. So the first level is physical, then the energy body, the mental, emotional, and the upper pieces are the intuitive and spirit work. And so when you're working in this realm, you are actually having very profound impacts. There's a downward causation or a downward effect where work in this realm is very positively influencing the physical body. So tools in this realm could be things like EMDR, applied psychoneurobiology or psychokinesiology from Dr. Klinghart's work, some of the tapping systems like EFT or emotional freedom technique, emotion code is another. And for people that are open to this work, there's a great book that fortunately, a personal friend of mine who's an amazing energy healer, Amy D. Scher, she wrote a book called How to Heal Yourself When No One Else Can. It gets into working. It's not a talk therapy type thing. A lot of times that's not what people need. A lot of times it's what do we need to do from an energetic perspective to remove the imprint, to remove the cellular memory, to remove the impact that these emotional traumas and conflicts that have been stored in the body have on our organs. Dr. Klinghart talks about how these emotional factors can influence the blood flow in certain organs or certain areas of the body that then allow microbes to kind of move in. So that book, How to Heal Yourself When No One Else Can, is a great book that also gives you some very practical things, some, scripts, some very good tools that you can go through to help move the needle in this realm.
Well, that sounds like a very good resource that, it is unfortunate because there's those stigmas, it's all in your mind or there's a psychosomatic reality. And there is, but if you just limit it to, that means you have this option, which is the only option, which could be counseling, or it could be, which can be very helpful, but you're really limiting yourself. That's what you're sharing. There's all kinds of ways to help emotional well-being, and some of that can be just good counseling, but that isn't the only tool that is available, and it's usually not comprehensive in its success for sure. So emotional well-being kind of leads us into another part of the brain, or into the limbic system, and how we really kind of have this parasympathetic, sympathetic reality. That how do we get that balance? And I think that's what you've been working with for a lot of years on step 5.
Yeah, so this is one of the steps that I think could make sense earlier in a program for some people, later for others. But the limbic system is the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus. Some people call it the feeling and reacting brain. It's involved in our surveillance of our external environment, what is safe in terms of things that maybe we smell or see or hear or taste or feel. So you can think of it as kind of the alarm center, the anxiety switch, and the limbic system impacts the immune system, the endocrine system, the autonomic nervous system, which has far-reaching implications in terms of blood pressure and heart rate and breath and digestion and all kinds of things. And so many different triggers can lead to limbic system impairment. It can be completely physical. This is not the same as mental emotional contributors, though it can be. You can have a mental emotional trauma that triggers a limbic response. But you could also have an exposure to mold in a water damaged building, or a chemical, or a pesticide, or a microbe, a bacteria, a virus. Any of those kinds of things can trigger limbic system impairment. And so I oftentimes think of these tools as helpful later in the process. Let's say you had a tiger, maybe mold in your living environment was your tiger, your body is correctly responding that there is a very real threat at some point, but later you identify it, you remediate it, you move, whatever. Maybe now it's like the kitten walking outside the window, and yet your limbic system sees that small amount of mold. We're never going to be mold free. And it says, oh my God, the tiger is here. And it responds in that same threatening way. And so what you're doing with tools like the DNRS system or dynamic neural retraining system or the Gupta program is you're rebooting or you're recalibrating an actual threat versus the perception of threat. So it's now a small actual threat. So the perception of that threat should also be small. It shouldn't be over perceived. And so these kinds of tools, I think, are very, very helpful. One of the things that I've observed over the years is they're not always tools people are drawn to do. They do take some time, 30 to 60 minutes a day. I've done DNRS. I found it tremendously helpful. I found some of the improvements that I got from it persisted even years later after having stopped it. I did it an hour a day for about 7 months a few years ago. But I think that, work in this realm is very, very helpful. And then if someone's not really in a position to be able to commit to doing those more driver's seat type limbic system work, there are passenger seat, as one of my colleagues, Dr. Talia Hale, refers to it. There are other tools that you can use, like Brain Tap that we talked about earlier, that you wear a headset and you kind of listen, or frequency specific microcurrent. It's kind of like a TENS unit that you put on some patches, and they have programs that work with the limbic system and the vagus nerve and the parasympathetics and so on. So what we're really trying to do in this realm with the limbic system and the vagus nerve and in supporting that parasympathetic response is optimizing rest, digest, detoxify, and heal. Lots of other tools. Heart math is another fairly common tool people will talk about. The ionic foot baths can be helpful because some of them actually use frequencies that are stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system to then support detoxification. And then when we get into the vagus nerve as well, Dr. Stanley, I believe he's a doctor, maybe not. Stanley Rosenberg is the author, and the book is The Healing Power of the Vagus Nerve. And so there are some exercises in that book, accessing the healing power of the vagus nerve, that he talks about that can be really profound for dealing with the vagus nerve, getting the body into more of a parasympathetic state. And we really cannot heal in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. We have to focus on calming the nervous system, calming the limbic system, and tonifying or supporting the parasympathetic nervous system. So again, foundational to set the stage for the healing process.
Hey, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ditch the Quick Fix. If you've received value from this episode, we'd love it if you would share it with somebody who's either on or seeking a path for better health. And if you're ready to take the next step, just head on over to ditchthequickfix.com. And I'll see you next time when we continue our conversation with Scott Forsgren. Hope you have a great day.